As Americans, we don't want to hear stories of bad behavior from our Revolutionary Army, but both red and bluecoats committed some real questionable acts and went through intense hardship in the battle for American liberty. You probably heard of Benedict Arnold, obviously, but you likely don't know that he was responsible for the death of John André, the British Army major who was Arnold's contact. During the war, Arnold was in command of West Point. That's up the Hudson a bit north of New York City. West Point was a key strategic position for the Continental Army, and once he decided to betray the colonists, it was an easy matter for him to hand the position over to his British bosses.
In exchange for £20,000, I shall transfer to you the plans for West Point.
In September 1780, André was apprehended by colonial forces who found a map of West Point on him. He was arrested and imprisoned, but Arnold managed to escape before he too was caught. A board of 14 military generals decided André should be executed as a spy, but Washington and others were less convinced. André was a well-regarded man who impressed them with his manners and leadership skills. Washington even attempted a prisoner exchange in return for Arnold, but nothing came of it. André pled for clemency in an October 1st letter addressed to Washington, writing, "Let me hope, sir, that if aught in my character impresses you with esteem towards me, if aught in my misfortunes marks me as the victim of policy and not of resentment, I shall experience the operation of these feelings in your breast by being informed that I am not to die on a gibbet." It didn't work. André was hanged the next day. It's well known that the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge was especially bad. But while conditions there were brutal, it wasn't the only place where the cold made it dangerous for the Continental Army. The bad weather wasn't the only peril they faced. That winter, disease ran rampant through the ranks. Typhus, influenza, and that future Oregon Trail star dysentery all spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. The men also lacked suitable clothing to protect themselves from the elements, including shoes. And then there was a serious lack of supplies, to the point where soldiers and officers alike were sent out into the countryside to scavenge and even beg for food. The Boston Massacre took place on March 5, 1770, when a group of colonists approached a young British soldier guarding the city's customs house. There had already been bloody clashes between independence-minded patriots, British soldiers, and Loyalist colonists, so both sides were prepared for things to pop off. As soon as a lone soldier called for backup, more British soldiers appeared, and so did more colonists. What happened next isn't clear, but at some point a soldier's gun discharged, either accidentally or on purpose, and the other soldiers began firing on the colonists. As the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead and 6 more were wounded. The soldiers were arrested and tried, where they were successfully defended by John Adams. The group was cleared of murder charges, though 2 were convicted of manslaughter.
You have just been acquitted by a jury of New England men. Massachusetts is my country's.
But the story didn't stop there. Relations between the colonies and Britain were bad and getting worse, and the manner in which the incident was framed in the aftermath didn't help. Silversmith and artisan Paul Revere, of one if by land, two if by sea fame, mass-produced an image depicting a bunch of bloodthirsty, snarling British soldiers firing into a defenseless crowd of colonists, and in Revere's version, the colonists were unarmed. Reality had been quite different. In an early example of the power of fake news, Revere's engraving fueled the colonists' anger, accompanied as it was by protest pamphlets and poems. With the onset of the American Revolution, it's estimated that about 60,000 Loyalists fled the colonies for other British outposts, bringing a further 15,000 enslaved people along with them. Whatever their reasons for staying loyal to the British Crown, many left out of fear of violent reprisals on the part of the colonists. The reasons were varied. Some had property they were looking to maintain via the English system. Others were just under the belief that the crown was correct in their treatment to the colonies. Whatever it was, turns out their fears were often justified. There were stories of mobs descending on Loyalist homes to deliver rough justice. Bad enough that many fled their close-knit communities and long-established livelihoods. Some traveled north to Canada, while others found their way to farther-flung British colonies or even returned to Britain itself. Among these refugees, some found themselves practically destitute, relying on food lines and other handouts to survive. As for those who stayed, well, more on that in a sec, but let's just say it didn't go too well. By November of 1778, the region that's now central New York State was the focus of conflict as colonists, British forces, and indigenous Iroquois people fought for control. On November 11th, a skirmish broke out at a fort near the village of Cherry Valley. Before we get too deep, the Iroquois is a term that refers to a group of 5 tribes, or nations as we usually say. I'm just going to use the term Iroquois here because there's a couple of different ways to refer to them, just so we're all on the same page. Anyway, British Loyalists attacked and trapped the Continentals inside the garrison, while the Iroquois destroyed the village in retaliation for previous strikes against tribal settlements. The 300 or so Continentals inside faced about 600 Iroquois, as well as some 200 Loyalists. Some 13 to 16 Continental soldiers were killed, along with 30 civilians, while another 70 non-combatants were taken captive. In response, Washington and the Continental Congress okayed another round of retaliatory violence that raised over 40 Iroquois settlements. But none of it needed to happen, at least not the way it went down. The Patriot commander, Colonel Ichabod Alden, had been forewarned of the enemy's advances, but didn't believe it, so he failed to prepare the garrison for the attack. He also reportedly refused villagers who asked to stow their property inside the fort. It's not clear why Alden seemed to think Cherry Valley wouldn't be attacked, but he paid dearly, dying in the assault. In 1773, Newgate Prison opened in Connecticut, taking the place of an old copper mine. So you know where it is today. It's a bit west of the airport in Hartford. That's the middle of no place now, and was even more no place back then. At first, the semi-subterranean cells housed typical criminals, but after 1775, the inmate population grew to include Loyalists.
Those people were imprisoned, whether they were fighting in the war or not, and so I think that really speaks to who do we criminalize and why?
There was concern that political prisoners would be angrier and more ready to rebel than run-of-the-mill criminals, and judging by the 12 riots that happened between 1775 and 1782, they were absolutely right. After Loyalists joined the prison population, there were over 60 successful escapes and 3 separate fires, and at least 1 prison guard and multiple prisoners died in the uprisings. Looks like they should have made for Canada like a lot of the other Loyalists did. An account of the conditions at Newgate might give you pause. Many faced squalid living conditions underground, forced to work in mines or in a nearby nail factory, all while receiving regular beatings.
A bolt here that they would have been shackled to keep them in this location.
Some modern commentators have compared Newgate with notorious modern detention centers like Guantanamo Bay. There's quite a lot written in the Declaration of Independence about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but putting those concepts into practice can get complicated and fast. Within the Continental Army, there were stark differences between the treatment of officers and rank-and-file soldiers when it came to quarters, food, and other basics. The inequities sometimes inspired outright insurrection, as in the cases of the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny and New Jersey Line Mutiny, both in 1781. It began when Continental soldiers in Morristown, New Jersey— this is the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny one, so don't let that town confuse you. Anyway, the soldiers complained that their enlistment contracts were being violated, pointing out that their commitment was to be for 3 years or the duration of the war. They were 3 years in and ready to go home, but their commanding officers weren't having it, so the troops mutinied. During negotiations, mutineers promised to return if they were paid, clothed, and fed properly. Food was a serious problem. Mutineers in a different region were reportedly only allowed to eat the rations discarded by their own officers. The Pennsylvania Line Mutiny ended more or less peacefully, but the other one, not so much. The New Jersey Line Mutiny never really settled, despite negotiations and even troops from New York being brought in to calm the mutiny. Eventually, 3 of the leaders were executed on Washington's orders. That ultimately ended the mutiny. While Washington may have attempted to legitimize the young republic by honoring the rules of engagement, both sides still committed war crimes. In the 1778 Old Tappan incident, also known as the Baylor Massacre, colonial soldiers in New York under the command of Colonel George Baylor were surprised by British troops, who snuck into their quarters and bayoneted them while they slept. In the 1781 Battle of Groton Heights, British forces commanded by newly turned traitor Benedict Arnold attempted to take Fort Griswold in Groton, Connecticut. The British fared badly, and one surviving commander, Colonel William Ledyard, ordered his men to stand down.
Ledyard surrendered his sword, which was then used to kill him.
On the other side, wounded Continental soldiers were reportedly killed in retaliation. British accounts, meanwhile, have nothing to say about a massacre or exactly how Ledyard died. The 1780 Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina saw over 1,000 British casualties, while a volunteer militia of colonists saw only an estimated 90 casualties. But there are reports that captured British and Loyalist soldiers were tortured and even executed in the field. Some referenced an earlier offensive in which British commander Bannister Tarleton reportedly gave no quarter to surrendering colonists, citing this incident as reason for their brutal revenge. You know who didn't have it easy? The natives. It didn't matter which side they chose, the revolution put them in harm's way. One example is the Gnadenhutten Massacre of 1782, which just happened to be the deadliest massacre in Ohio state history. By 1782, a group of Native American people, variously reported to be from the Lenape, Mohican, and Delaware tribes, had converted to Christianity and were living in what is now Ohio. British forces claimed they were abetting rebel patriots, while others claimed the group was somehow responsible for raids on local settlements, despite being avowed pacifists. So again, these were Christian pacifists who did not take sides in the war. Soon enough, a Pennsylvania militia arrived. That's the colonial side, aka the Americans. They were determined to bring someone to account for the attacks. The militia convinced indigenous people to give up their arms and allow themselves to be detained. But just a day later, the militia killed an estimated 90 villagers and burned the village. There was no evidence that the converts had anything to do with the attacks or any violence in the first place. In response, some tribes turned their back on the revolutionaries and even retaliated against colonial captives in their custody. By the 18th century, many European powers were quick to acknowledge that certain prisoners of war had rights. In the American Revolution, however, captured colonists were understood to be traitors. This means that their treatment varied quite a bit, sometimes veering into brutal territory. One British general even ominously said that captured patriots were, quote, destined to the court, that is, that they would be hanged if they were ever in British custody. The issue went both ways. While Americans captured by the British could face harsh, even squalid conditions that threatened their health, Loyalists could experience much of the same, or at least they said they did. In the Aysgill affair, captured British Captain Charles Aysgill was ordered executed by George Washington after Loyalists hanged Continental Army Captain Jack Huddy. Aysgill wasn't executed, but he alleged that his time as a prisoner was one of very poor treatment indeed. Washington denied the assertion. When a military figure in the American Revolution earns the nickname Bloody Ben, you know the origin story of that name has gotta be pretty messed up. And for Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, it's been so notorious that his name became shorthand for brutality. In May 1780, Tarleton was commanded to stamp out any remnants of rebellion in the colony of South Carolina. On May 29th, near Waxhaws, Tarleton and his troops surrounded and defeated a group of patriots. The group, consisting of about 350 men, surrendered. After that surrender, however, British soldiers continued shooting. Ultimately, 113 colonists were killed and 203 captured in the Battle of Waxhaws, compared to 19 British dead. The event became emblematic of British brutality for the rest of the war, used by pro-patriot sources to bolster their cause and further the perception of the British as bloodthirsty, heinous overlords. Most striking, it gave rise to the term Tarleton's Quarter, a darkly ironic phrase that meant a victor would give no mercy at all but would instead vengefully kill everyone despite the rules of engagement. Since the days of the Revolutionary War, tarring and feathering has gotten an almost mythical reputation. For many modern readers, the idea of coating someone in hot tar followed by a layer of loose feathers sounds both humiliating and utterly painful. But how messed up was it really? First, there are no reports that tarring and feathering ever killed anyone, yet it could still be pretty brutal. Some people could suffer blisters from the hot tar, while an angry mob certainly wasn't above landing a few good kicks and blows during the process. The main point of tarring and feathering was to inflict psychological suffering. A person who was subjected to the treatment was displayed for others to gawk at. One man, a sailor named George Gaylor, was tarred and feathered in 1769 for working with British customs.
You approve of brutal and illegal acts to enforce a political principle, Sam!
Afterward, his captors reportedly paraded their victim around in a cart, occasionally whipping him for 3 hours. Gaylor clearly survived, given that he later sued a number of his attackers, but was also obviously upset over the humiliation of the incident. If you were a supporter of the Patriot cause but didn't want to fight, then you might choose to be an activist in your hometown. After all, what danger could there be in vocally supporting the cause from your home, at least compared to what others were risking? Turns out, you could risk quite a lot. Take the case of the town of Falmouth, which is now known as Portland, Maine. This colonial stronghold was attacked by Royal Navy ships in 1775, which bombarded the town and destroyed over 400 buildings. To be fair, the commander of the squadron gave the townspeople warning that he was about to attack, reading a formal notice that accused them of unpardonable rebellion. The attack soon became a powerful symbol for the Patriot cause, and why Falmouth and not one of the other many settlements along the coast that were deemed just as rebellious? The weather simply made it easier for the group of ships to make it to Falmouth. A similar attack happened in Fairfield, Connecticut in 1779. There, 97 homes and 48 businesses were burned. Residents were offered land in Ohio, then owned by Connecticut, which came to be colorfully known as the Firelands. Throughout the war, quite a few enslaved people living in the colonies sided with the British. That's because the British were largely seen as potential liberators, to the point where one man even renamed himself British Freedom. For Black Americans, the Patriots were more frequently enslavers who wanted to keep them in bondage. The British were more amenable to freeing slaves, though they didn't outlaw slavery in most of their territories until 1833. Still, for many enslaved people, it must have looked far better over on the British side. That was made all the more attractive when some British officers began promising freedom for slaves who fought on their side. Quite a few sided with the British, including people ostensibly owned by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. After the war ended, they were faced with the undoubtedly depressing prospect of returning to their old lives. Both Washington and Jefferson took steps to reclaim their slaves in the aftermath of the Revolution. Though it's been traditionally associated with Native American attacks, the truth is that both colonists and British forces used scalping throughout the war to terrorize the other side, or at least they used the threat of scalping. According to groundless rumors, legends, and hoaxes on the early American frontier, there are some accounts from soldiers on both sides that the enemy scalped deceased combatants. Some of the more horrific stories maintain some soldiers were scalped while still alive, while others are more vague about the type of mutilation that was said to have occurred. There is a good chance, however, that scalping was more of a horrifying rhetorical device and may not have happened nearly as often as those accounts suggest. Whether or not it actually happened on the battlefield, the idea that the enemy, regardless of the side, scalped their foes was held up as an example of their brutality. Printers went wild with accusations, printing pamphlets and newspapers purporting to carry true accounts of scalping. Some patriot-friendly sources used stories of scalping hunting Loyalists as a way to bolster support for the rebellion. If you were a rebellious colonial, undoubtedly you didn't want to be captured by the British.
Take this one to Camden. Here's a spy. Hang him, put his body on display.
Some prisoners of war could be treated pretty humanely if they were lucky and perhaps of a higher profile than the rest, but the truly unlucky would be put in prison so harsh that the barbarity of their conditions remains notorious more than 2 centuries after it happened. The worst of the worst were the prison ships anchored near Manhattan. Rebels were more likely to die aboard one of those floating prisons than they were on the field of battle. Specifically, an estimated 11,000 people died on prison ships alone during the American Revolution. Living conditions aboard the ships were atrocious. Prisoners were packed below decks, leading to overheating, the spread of disease, and criminal neglect. Some aboard the ships reported that the dead would lie amongst the living for days, and when they were finally discovered by British soldiers, would simply be tossed overboard. Nearby people in Brooklyn would sometimes recover the remains on shore and give them a proper burial. Food was especially heinous, it seems, with meals made up of rotten, moldy ingredients and foul water drawn directly from the East River. The HMS Jersey became especially notorious for its conditions, to the point where prisoners nicknamed it simply Hell. The stark political divides in colonial America were not only distressing from an interpersonal standpoint, but they could also grow deeply violent. Anti-loyalist mobs menaced British sympathizers with social ostracization and physical violence, even killing some. Colonel Charles Lynch, a Virginia military man, was so notorious for his propensity to kill loyalists that the term lynching supposedly comes from his actions. Violence grew so bad that it pushed some loyalists to flee the American colonies. Liberty's Exiles notes that many of these refugees left the rebellious colonies for other British territories, especially the northern colonies that would become part of Canada. A secret attack is not necessarily a standout horror of war, though it's bound to be violent and potentially bloody nonetheless. Yet one secret attack of the American Revolution proved to be yet more fodder for the perceived brutality of British soldiers. It happened near Paoli, Pennsylvania. There, on September 20, 1777, 5,000 British soldiers commanded by General Charles Grey descended upon colonial troops encamped there. To maintain the element of surprise, the British declined to use their loud muskets and instead planned to rely on hand-to-hand weapons like their bayonets to kill the sleeping American soldiers. The colonials lost 272 men who were either killed or taken as prisoners of war. Later accounts by Americans allege that some British soldiers had killed people who had already surrendered. The Paoli Massacre, as it came to be known, was eventually made another emblem of British outrages against patriots. Later in the war, the commander of the American troops who were killed led a charge against Stony Point, New York, which recalled some of the worst elements of the attack at Paoli. The Continental soldiers also attacked at night, using only their bayonets to kill 94 enemy soldiers and capture 472 more. Even the most scrupulously neutral and mundane people living in the colonies at the time of the American Revolution simply could not escape the war. Even if they refused to participate in battles, mob violence, or any of the other myriad ways in which people engaged with the conflict, it still could come to their front door. The everyday impact of the war was widespread, with military action happening from Georgia to the northern reaches of New England. Both British and Continental armies moved broadly through that vast region, passing through settlements as densely occupied as cities and as remote as lonely single-family farms. Colonial Americans were also often confronted by the violence of nearby battles and war-induced food shortages, which put considerable pressure on even the simplest day-to-day lives. The movement of demanding and hungry troops through the land could be especially devastating. Soldiers often took whatever they wanted, sometimes with a semi-formal requisition, sometimes not. Crops, farm animals, and even wood from buildings and fences could be fair game. Some rumors even suggest that troops would claim women for their own as they passed through. It got so bad that some families chose to abandon their homes and become refugees as troops approached.